Thank you, Alex. And thank you, everyone, for staying late. It's snowy, it's cold outside, but we're discussing something very important. We're putting a context for all the AI discussion we have today, and that's a geopolitical context. So thanks for staying with us. And Alex has already introduced our two speakers today, but I want to briefly add a little bit of that. So Paul, sitting next to me, has been a data scientist, data architect, and a serial entrepreneur, and also an advocate of universal basic income. And the company he runs provides, actually help with the big companies to deal with the data, provide data services. So your company primarily deal with data. And Chris, definitely known as the man with the coolest T-shirt at DLD, and also he's a scientist on AI, also a leading voice on machine learning and machine logic as well. And I have to admit, I pretty much understand only half of what he says, but even with that little half, it's incredibly brilliant. So Arago, the company Chris leads, deal with the process that's basically help with big companies to automate the IT services and the system. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay, thanks. Alex shared with us that Kai-Fu Lee said, we only deal with the number 1, number 2, and there's no bronze medal. But I actually want to hear, first off, from Paul, what you will see as the top 3 AI players now, and what that will be in 5 years' time.
Well, the way I see the macroeconomic context for AI right now, there's 3 major jurisdictions and then there's the rest. There's China, there's Europe, and there's the United States. And that's really, those are the 3 juggernauts in this work. As far as the rest, I mean, I would count Canada as included in the rest. You may know that Jeff Hinton is a Canadian, and he is the primary scientist behind the backpropagation algorithm that is behind all modern neural network technology. And a lot of those researchers are still in Canada, and there is a nice AI ecosystem in Canada. So there's the rest. I would say in terms of ranking right now, it's hard to dispute Google's lead, and just by nature of the fact that it's headquartered in the United States, independent of the fact that a lot of that research is actually happening in the DeepMind project in London. I would say Google is in the lead, and that puts the US in the lead. After the US, I would have to say China, the rest, then Europe, in terms of the ranking. So
US, China, the rest, and Europe.
Europe, I think, has a bit of a challenge in terms of the AI race, and it's a data challenge. It's a data acquisition challenge. It's a unfortunate and unintended consequence of some consequences of the GDPR.
And that's now. What about, let's say, in 5 years' time?
In 5 years' time, I believe that the technologies to permit Europe and the rest of the world to unite, to create what I would consider a socially beneficial data governance and data acquisition strategy, which requires technology investment in standards, on standards of care for data stewardship and data custody. I believe there's a path for Europe and the rest to unite to compete nicely against the US and China.
Interesting. And how about you, Chris? Do you agree with that ranking?
So I want to be a bit careful with this ranking because it's all, I think the problem is a little bit more multidimensional, right? So if you look at this from a geopolitical strategy side, you see that the US has flipped their strategies and they now follow a very self-centered, egotistical strategy, which means their large companies are no longer in sync with the government strategy, which is not very healthy. In Europe, we're just finding the strategies. We're thinking about it, and we're putting the papers out, and then we're gauging the reaction, so we're definitely behind there. And in China, people have made the strategy, and they're just executing it, right? They're just running and going. That's definitely the lead on the strategic side there. Company-wise, I'd say that you have platform companies, very successful ones in the US, that propagate not just the research, but mainly the execution of AI. There you have, we have a lot of contact here in the West with the Western companies. But I would say that also China has these large platform companies by itself, which are just as successful, have just as many users, and have just as much research to be executed upon because a lot of that research is open source. So I think there's a par. In Europe, there is absolutely nothing. Like the execution of AI is zero. That I would say is the biggest weakness that we see. Then we have the knowledge that comes after, the why that drives things. And I would say that in the US, we have lost a lot of knowledge because things are being outsourced when you don't know them. In Europe, we actually have slowed ourselves down in profitability in industry because we only outsource in Europe once we understand things, which in the race for giving information to machines or giving practice to machines is the only advantage that Europe actually holds. So that's a point up. And in China, China has worked itself bottom up. They're about halfway there, right? So there, Europe is actually on the research side. Look, Europe is doing great. But on the execution side, Europe is extremely weak. On the research side, China is pretty weak. It's just coming up there. But they have an incredible willingness to execute and finance and take risks. And in America, you kind of have a bit of a stall system inside. There's good research being there. There's fantastic universities. But there's a little running around the circles in there. So I would say there you have very clearly China, Europe, US, if you want to raise it. So but I see this in multiple dimensions because you have to say there are many factors that will influence the future.
Okay, so basically you don't give us a single ranking, but you see that in strategy, execution, the why and how, and the research capacity, and under each dimension,
yes,
there will be rankings.
Exactly. I'd say that it's very hard to get a single ranking out of this right now. I would say that China is way ahead because the ability to execute whatever you think up is, in the end, what makes reality.
And do you see China and Europe complement each other on that?
That very much depends on the decisions Europe takes, right? If Europe decides to do nothing, I would make the prediction, like absolutely nothing. I would make the prediction that we have a great opportunity of putting ourselves into being developing nations in 20 years from now. And I think that's a horrible thought. I don't think that's going to happen. I think that if we just invest into risk culture, we're going to be knowledge delivery agents basically into Chinese AI. And if we actually have the courage to build up the execution ourselves, then there is going to be an interesting competition here. Yep. And I would see that the American companies are extremely strong in this, but as I said, there's a not well synced currently between economy and policy on AI right now in the US.
The opportunity that I see for 5 years, which is, I think when you say doing something, there are actual ideas on what we should be doing that are circulating in our circles. And if you think of what we really need to do is we need to resolve some sort of a third way, maybe it's a fourth way. The third way in this context would be the GDPR. But we know that the GDPR has some unintended consequences that we need to resolve somehow through either technology or standards or maybe policy renewal. The reality is China has solved the data acquisition problem in a variety of ways, and Xin speaks convincingly about the variety of ways. I wonder if I can just prompt you to chime in with that.
Or you can share your take of that.
Well, basically, in China, what's going on right now is there's essentially a very enormous popular support for the way the government is currently engaging with data, and the government is really not engaging with data very much at all. So it is essentially, everyone is more or less abandoned the idea of privacy as a result of the security apparatus and the fact that the government has made it a matter of policy that any data that the government can reach, it may reach at its own discretion for either facilitation of commercial activity or for facilitation of projects in the social interest. So China, as a technocracy, has solved the data access and data integration problem in a way that makes us, the rest, Europe and Canada and some of the rest of the world, makes us very uncomfortable. I myself don't want the government to have real-time access to all of my private communications, etc. Meanwhile, the American model also makes a lot of the rest of the world uncomfortable. The idea that, like, if America is part of the West, it's the Wild West. This idea of data where you can't revoke your consent for its use, data as a transferable asset that you lose control over when you hand it over to an entity like a Facebook. This idea that companies like Equifax can essentially have what I think is a generally agreed upon terrible standard of care for the data that they were able to acquire, and really has no meaningful consequence. So the Wild West. I think there's a path for us, the rest of the world, to renew GDPR with some slight policy changes, some adoption of standards, some adoptions of data inventory. A data inventory can be done in the public interest if we adopt a data consent registry system, where today when I click OK, and I clicked OK about 50 times since I landed in Europe, when I click OK, I don't read the contract and I don't get a receipt. But imagine if my receipt for my consent was on a blockchain. So now my right to revoke it becomes real. But at the same time, that blockchain creates a data inventory system that can let everyone know what everybody else has. And as a result, we can start building companies to unlock the power of that data. So certain kinds of technologies, policies, and standards from a standards of care perspective can let the rest of the world unite in a way that is more socially beneficial and comfortable than either the American way or the Chinese way.
So I actually fully agree with that, and we should really listen to this idea. And obviously, you've thought about it a lot. Right? I had the pleasure of having the conversation yesterday already, and we had much more time than here. I think that that's a fantastic idea, and GDPR was a first step in terms of legislation. Right? It has a lot of very clumsy pieces, and maybe the legislation was also done for the wrong reasons, right? We try to shut out companies like Google and Facebook, which is a wrong approach. If you don't like something, start competing with it, right? So which I believe would be much better. So I fully agree with what you're saying on the idea of having the ability to track your data that's actually being used and having a right to revoke your data access for someone actually implementable, right? Because right now it's not implementable at all. I'd also, however, like to point out that data just isn't everything, right? We've run, because with that, I feel a lot of times when I have these conversations in corporations or also with politicians, you have this, you know, China has so much data and they have the central control of everything, would you just go and die? And I think this is totally wrong. This is a failed excuse. We cannot use that as an excuse. AI is more than just perception. If you look at an AI stack, if you look at, there is perception that starts, right? And then you have to understand what came in, and then you have to make up your mind, and then you have to solve a problem, and then you have to execute, and then you have to reflect, right? Perception problems are the ones that rely solely on data. And just because what we're building in most AI systems today, which is the reflexes or an equivalent to the reflex where we directly connect perception with execution, that is like the first step. We've made the baby step, a very powerful and very impressive baby step, and that relies on data. But most of the other stuff actually relies on the ability to understand causality, which you cannot do really well with statistics. And I see in people who try to approach it in a statistical way, they oftentimes mistake, again, causality and correlation, which is very dangerous. So I believe that the actual knowledge, the knowledge, why have you done something? Why do these things go together? Which is knowledge that is deeply embedded in a lot of people in the rest, right? That is something that has also a high value. So why I totally agree with what we have to say about data and this idea of creating that space where your data is safe and you can share it and you actually know who has what. I think that's fantastic. And I think people need to care much more about that. We also shouldn't give up and say like just, oh God, everybody has more data we've already lost. That is not an excuse. We've just lost the first step for perception. And we've lost badly there, but there's many more things to do that rely on things that we have.
Do you agree that data is the deciding factor, or is just one of the factors?
Well, I am an admitted data nerd, so I love data. My company's tagline is "Love Your Data." I'm unapologetic about the fact that I actually disagree back at you. I think ultimately it's all about the data. If you think of what we're doing in AI systems now, we're really doing behavioral analytics systems in order to create predictive analytics on human behavior. Well, I think it stands to reason that as we improve our ability to predict human behavior, what we'll be able to do is eventually, if you know exactly what the human would have done in that situation, you don't need the human at all. If you look at what Tesla did with the Model S by shipping a car with cameras in all four corners and an AT&T radio, as we all know, the old chestnut says, if it's free, you're the product, not the customer. Well, the AT&T radio in the Model S is free, and you need to sign terms of service that ship the content of those cameras back to Tesla in real time. As a result, Tesla has acquired the world's largest database of perfectly witnessed humans at work at the wheel of a car. Now, what they've done with that is at the heart of their entire automation effort of creating a robot that, based on the predictive analytics of what the people did for real when a deer jumped, or when a bicycle came, or when they came to a red light, or when the red light turned green, based on what people actually did, they're able to replace that with a robot to perform that task for a meaningful amount of it. Now, they're not driveway to driveway yet, but for a meaningful amount of the work, they're able to replace the person with their automation.
So I don't think there's a contradiction here, right? Because driving is a perceptual task. That's why you can also drive in and listen to an audiobook and actually understand what's happening in the audiobook, right? So as soon as you add another layer of task to driving, let's say you want to keep a schedule while delivering stuff, there's much more that you need just than the data that comes in through your perception when you go. So I don't think there's a contradiction. I totally agree that given that Europe heavily relies on the automotive industry, it is not very smart that we are not collecting that data.
Right, and so at the heart of all of this, the way that I see the world is that ultimately AI algorithms are going to be innovated in London by the DeepMind project, and eventually will be built into the Google Cloud, and we'll be able to access those algorithms using APIs. But the reason Google first open sourced TensorFlow, and everyone else followed suit and open sourced most of their AI algorithms, is ultimately because the algorithms have very little value if you don't have a data training corpus in order to leverage and unlock the power of the algorithm to demonstrate machine intelligence. Well, and so I see all of this as a data acquisition problem. I think China and the US are ahead.
But a lot of the algorithms, like we can probably have this conversation forever, but a lot of those algorithms are specifically focused on data trainable like machines, and I totally agree. Like once you have an algorithm that is pretty trainable by data, the algorithm by itself, who cares? But then we also have to see that the cool algorithms that are in the press right now are 30 years old or 40 years old algorithms. There are actually newer algorithms and IP being developed which is not open sourced yet. I see TensorFlow is actually a fantastic hiring funnel, right? For which is produced, because as soon as you see people contributing good stuff, you should hire them if you were Google.
So we've talked about the importance of data, we've talked about the importance of why and understanding the knowledge behind that. But there are other factors as well. How about trust and also the ecosystem, government policies, and the cultures? What are these playing in moving one region or country in the AI arms race?
Mm-hmm. Should I go first? I have strong opinions about data and trust and responsibility and standards of care. Especially for data in the public interest. And so in Canada, we have a movement to create data trusts in the public interest in two major categories: the smart cities projects and also in the healthcare sector. And in this sector, there are some real problems. It turns out that you have a digital fingerprint, and if anybody can connect that fingerprint to you, any effort at anonymizing data then will fail. And de-anonymization of data on the basis of your digital fingerprint is quite doable. So even if, for example, you remove all your cookies and you log out of everything, if you still visit the same 10 websites in the same pattern every day, an algorithm can discover that it and reconnect you to the to your identity online. This creates a lot of problems for healthcare data in the public interest and smart city data in the public interest, because de-anonymization by algorithm is a doable problem. So I think that adopting technology that manifests and creates the reality that trust is personal, trust is extended to a single human being based on their credentials, to access that. Think of any army. If you're cleared top secret, it's not you and your team that gets to look at that. It's just you. And you can lose those credentials. And that level of personal trust is something that we need to adopt as an industry. I'm an advocate for something that some may think is slightly controversial, but I'm an advocate for a national identity system to be built in Canada that permits us to credential even foreign citizens. Because I think that when our banking sector, our telecommunications sector, and our insurance sector are all heavily outsourced globally, we need to have a strong sense of the identity of the people who have access to our national critical infrastructure. Let's face it, war in 2020 is not submarines off the coast. It's your telecommunications or financial or electricity distribution sectors shutting down. And so we have a lot of work to do in cybersecurity. I spend a lot of time in there.
Well, the future of conflict definitely is a very interesting topic, which I happen to deal a lot with, and the problem that we have in infrastructure, right, is far beyond data. We have systems that are 40 years old, 50 years old, that just did not care about anything that we have in security today. So that's a very hard problem to tackle, and I think that the funny thing is everybody has those. Right? Even the ones propagating most attacks that we see today have those problems themselves. So that's a funny thing if you look at it. China actually might be in the best position here because a lot of their technical infrastructure is actually much more modern than the ones that we have built.
Plus, they never outsource to anybody.
So
it's all managed internally.
Oh, well, but they do. They buy lots of knowledge outside, but it's just more modern, right? It was ramped up in the last 20 years, maybe. But generally, if you look at this policymaker, the trust that you're speaking of, right? That is amazing. Like our entire society, everything that we do is human. Our entire society, our human race is based on trust. That we're no longer living in caves, but we're living in cities now, and that we're having a fairly peaceful life and don't go and club each other all the day. That is all based on trust. Yet we are so easily lived with trust. Like most people, the dangerous thing about data is people don't care. They just give it away, right? And this is worse than your burglary, because after a burglary happens, you at least buy a lock, right? And which is stupid in the one hand, you should have bought it before, right? But when data problems happen, you shout for someone else to fix the problem, right? So I mean, we had the leakage of prominent people identity in Germany, and the first thing that comes out is not like, oh shit, we actually should take that security stuff seriously and finally understand that we shouldn't use 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 as our password. It goes like, we need to make a law to have the companies have us not have bad passwords. Like, how stupid is that? I think we need more responsibility in this, which again puts us to this courage part,
Standards
right?
Instead of laws.
We need the courage to actually take control, because it is actually possible to take control on that and make it usable, not just on the AI level or the national level, but actually on the person level as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
We have a little bit of time. I would love to open up to questions to the floor. I'm sure we covered a lot of things. We covered trust, we covered data, and we also covered the privacy and as well as legislations and policies. So any questions from the floor? Yes.
Is it on?
We can't hear you.
Can you still talk to the phone? Because we will record this session.
We should get a huge amount of data so we can transfer it into to use AI or to analyze them. But now more and more people, especially in the industry, they said there is no such like big data. We just got enough data and know how to analyze them. It's enough. How about the feeling about big data? How big it should be?
How big is big?
So
is that enough data or just
maybe just to
data?
rephrase the question for the audience that didn't hear it. Hopefully it did get recorded. So the question is really how much. There was a huge movement a few years ago about big data. And then the question becomes, what is enough data, and does data need to keep getting bigger, and how much does data matter in a world where an algorithm once trained, if it's successful at doing its job, there's a limit to diminishing returns to more data. I think this is more your field of expertise. Go right ahead.
Yeah, okay, so I think there definitely is a limit to the value of amount of data that you have, and we have ignored that for the longest time. Like for the longest time, when you ask people, what's your problem implementing AI, all they give you is say, no, all we need is more data, better quality data, and unbiased data. And that's simply not true, right? Because you need to be able to use data to describe the world you're living in. And there simply is never enough data to describe the now, because data is always backwards looking. It describes what happened and potentially what happened a while ago. And then you also, the more complex the system becomes that you're trying to model, that you're trying to automate, that you're trying for a machine to replicate, the exponentially more data you theoretically need in the shorter amount of time. So there simply is not possible to create all the data you need for a system to solve more complex and more complex and more complex problems, right? So you see, I mean, you've pointed this out in your question already, you see that there is kind of a usefulness curve coming where the collection of new data is more expensive than the use you can get through this. This is not like at the little data sets that a lot of people think of as big data today. There is a lot of data to be gathered that you actually need to use to do perception properly, especially in topics like self-driving cars and so on. But there definitely is a limit to the usefulness of data. So the excuse of someone who can collect infinite amount of data has infinite power, that excuse definitely does not exist. Yet, I think the point is data acquisition in the combination with data control. And the next step behind that or after that is the question of causal knowledge and the control of that causal knowledge, like a micro-patenting system or however you want to invent that. And this is actually where I believe that Europe can make a big step in the question of how can we control the data acquisition, how can we actually give that right to people and companies especially, but how can we also do that with knowledge that is not pure data.
Yeah. I also just want to add that good enough when there's safety and human lives at stake is a different question than good enough when you're doing predictive analytics for marketing. So for instance, we know about that famous Tesla accident where there was a truck and the car went right into the truck and it was the sky reflecting off the truck or something like that. Believe me, that data is being tested against every time that they ship a new version of their algorithm, because that was an edge case, and they had tested their algorithm across millions and millions and millions of driver hours, and no accident had occurred, so they shipped it to their fleet. But those edge cases become very valuable, and they require gargantuan amounts of data in order to find those extremely rare edge cases. And lives are in the balance.
See, but this is also, I mean, there's actually a good description where you can't get ahead just with the reflex reactions and data. Because if the human brain in an accident, in an emergency situation, makes a decision on what to do with the car, right, the decision is 90% wrong. So 90% of us will, when you see a deer, will not drive into the deer, but try to swerve around it, which is totally wrong to do for your safety thing, but yes. But it is what our monkey brain basically, because there's simply no time to think about it.
Yes, but they're testing their bot over
sure.
with a goal of safety, not a goal of outperforming the human. They need to find those situations where the bot doesn't perform well.
Well, all the edge cases, right? But these edge cases are typically arguing cases.
Yeah.
Any other questions from the floor? If not, I will ask another question. We talk about the AI arms race. What will be the end game of the arms race, and how different will be when we talk about the leaders, different leaders of that?
The end game of who, sorry?
Of AI arms, of the AI race.
That very much depends who wins, right? on the end game. I think a desirable end game would be that AI can do a lot of the things that keep us busy today that doesn't create any new impact, and we can focus on two things, which is doing more with each other, because I think there's definitely a lack of human-to-human interaction. And the second thing is doing more creative things, right? Because we haven't really invented much since the 70s.
Mm-hmm. How about you, Paul?
Well, I think it would be, I joined the basic income movement in 2014 because working in data and machine learning, it became clear that you have to choose between being a sociopath and ruining the future of work for everyone and creating global poverty and strife, or choose some sort of a beneficial future where the results of our work is humanity freed from toil. I'd rather stay optimistic and think that humanity being freed from toil is a nice outcome of the work that we're doing. I do think that depending on who wins, the outcomes can be very different. If in fact everyone in the West employs an algorithm that is feeding the bottom line of a single company in China, and we employ that with half of our payroll dollars instead of employing people, the concentration of wealth will become more extreme, and that will be problematic in and of itself. So I mean, I hope and dream that if and when we get that far in terms of human work automation, I hope and dream that it happens in a jurisdiction where we can tax the company that owns it.
All right, before we end, one last word from each one of you. We are in Europe. We're talking about how the West, basically Europe, can catch up with the AI race. On the to-do list, what will be the top priority you would suggest that Europe to take?
So I think that the top topic we have to focus on is the ability to execute. Like, use the stuff in real life and make a progression from there. I think most of the other things are technical problems, and I don't want to make the data problem small because it's a big problem, but we can propose great solutions for privacy and great solutions for control and all this if people just don't care, and if people do not execute. If we don't apply it, if we're afraid of doing something, then we'll run into problems no matter what, because other people are executing. On the positive side, or on the optimistic side of that, you can see that a lot of governments, and especially a lot of the small companies, have started that journey totally.
So basically, stop talking, do stuff.
Yes.
And how about you, Paul?
Yeah, I think I've already made my comments in terms of what I think we need to do in the next few years if we want to create a context in the rest of the world that creates a better outcomes for our society than the American Wild West and the Chinese technocratic approach. If we want that, we need to unlock the power of competitiveness, innovation, and some of the risks of acquiring large amounts of data right now are a drag on innovation appetite and even investment appetite in the rest of the world. We can't permit the US to continue to be the best capitalized Western world in terms of data platforms. The consequences of that are essentially a concentration of economic power in only 4 or 5 or 6 companies. If we want to permit entrepreneurs all over the world to win in this space, we're going to need to solve for how do we share data with each other, how do we integrate data amongst each other, how do we find out who has what data, how do we correctly, and while maintaining the trust of the population, integrate that data to either commercial or social interests, and we have not solved that problem.
So basically unleashing the power of data with citizen consent.
That's how I see the problem space, yeah.
All right, thank you so much. Please join me in thanking our 2 very brilliant panelists in sharing with us the insights.
Thank you, Xin.
Thank you very much.